Welcome everyone. My name is Younes Zangiabadi. I am the Executive Vice President of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. Today I'm honored to introduce our great moderator, who will be joined by distinguished experts to discuss facts in diplomacy in the Middle East. This panel is part of a discussion series by the IPD about the impact of COVID-19 on global order, international peace, and security. The discussion series is supported by the Canadian Department of National Defense, mobilizing insight in defense and security programs. Before I introduce our esteemed moderator, let me say a few words about our institute. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. Dialogue is not easy, especially when we are talking about a complex region such as the Middle East. As an institute dedicated to the cause of peace, our objective with panel discussions we host, like the one today, is to bring together experts with diverse and opposing views to discuss and debate complicated foreign policy issues of our time. We strongly believe that through these debates and discussions, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of each side's concerns and help our policymakers adopt a more creative and open-minded approach in managing the strategic challenges of the 21st century. Now, let me briefly introduce our moderator. Jacopo Shita is Sheikh Nasser Al Mohammed Al Sabah Doctoral Fellow at Durham University School of Government and International Affairs. Jacopo's doctoral project explores the role bore by China within Sino-Iranian relations from the 1979 revolution to the 2015 JCPOA. His main research interests are Sino-Iranian relations, China-Persian Gulf relations, and Iran's foreign policy. With that, I'll hand over the floor to Jacopo. Thanks very much for accepting our invitation to moderate this timely panel discussion. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Younes, for this fantastic introduction. And thank you so much for the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for having us today and putting together such a fantastic panel, which I will introduce in a minute. I just want to say that the format of today's discussion is, first of all, 3 or 4 minutes introduction remarks from each of our panelists. Then I will follow up with a couple of questions to each of them. And after that, the audience will be able to ask questions. So the time is quite compressed. So I would say, first of all, to all my panelists that try to not go longer than the 3 or 4 minutes we agreed for, especially for the introductory remarks. And to the audience, I want to say that as usual in this kind of panels, the chat function and the chat window is where you should put your questions. Very happy to have you writing down your questions all along the panel, and then I will pick them up and probably do some mashup at the end to better answer them and have a more comprehensive answer to the question. So I would say that without further ado, I will introduce the panelists very briefly, and I would say that the order I will follow in introducing them is also the order they will follow once speaking. So let me start with Dr. Jonathan Fulton, who is, first of all, a friend, but also, and most importantly, assistant professor of political science at Zayed University in Abu Dhabi, and Nonresident senior fellow for Middle East programs at the Atlantic Council. I'm very comfortable in saying that he is one, if not the leading expert on China-GCC relations, and he has published an immense amount of work on this topic. So it would be great to hearing what he thinks about vaccine diplomacy between China and the GCC. After Jonathan Fulton, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Judy Twigg. Professor Judy Twigg is Professor of Political Science at Virginia Commonwealth University, and I would say among her many affiliations, she is Senior Associate with the Global Health Policy Center and Russia and Eurasia Program of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And Professor Twigg is a leading expert on global health with a specific focus on Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia. So I think it would be great to have a Russian perspective and also a US perspective, as we basically agreed on vaccine diplomacy in the Middle East. Our third panelist is Professor Yahia Zoubir. Pardon me if I misspelled your name, Professor Zoubir, who is Professor of International Relations and International Management and the Director of Research in Geopolitics at the KEDGE Business School in France. And in 2020, he was fellow at the Brooklyn Doha Center. And Professor Zoubir is an expert and has written extensively on global governance, North Africa and the Middle East politics and international relations, and also on China's Belt and Road Initiative. And finally, last but not least, I would say, we are very pleased to have Professor Whiteside in our panel, who is one of the foremost experts on global health and the HIV and the AIDS in Africa and beyond. I would say he has had an extraordinary career around the world, and he is now professor at Wilfrid Laurier University School of International Policy and Governance, as well as professor at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And I would say is also an advisor at the institution that is hosting us today, so the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. And it's a great honor to have him, as well as all the other panelists with us today. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Jonathan, who will start this discussion. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Kobo, and thanks, Yunus, for putting this together. It's a really great panel on a very important topic. I guess I'm the token Canadian here today for this event. I'm not a public health expert by any stretch. I'm a political scientist, as Jacobo mentioned, and I live in Abu Dhabi, where I've been since 2006, and I've been watching China-Middle East relations in general, and specifically China and the Gulf. Now, it's been very interesting because I started my PhD in 2011, looking at China's relations with the Gulf monarchies. And I remember talking to somebody at that point on a research interview, and he said, how are you ever going to stretch this into 100,000 words? China and the Middle East, there's nothing there. And by the time I was finished, that had changed quite a bit. I'm working on a book right now that I hope to submit next week. And it's led me to read a lot of the earlier literature on China-Middle East relations from the past 20 years. And even 10 years ago, what you would find is that everybody described it as China buys a lot of energy and it sells a lot of cheap stuff, and that's pretty much the extent. And now what you can see, especially since the Belt and Road was announced in 2013, is that China's gone from simply an energy consumer and an economic partner to really having a much greater set of interests in the region. It's a political actor, it's minimally a security actor, and what we've seen in the past year is it's increasingly a governance actor as well, which is a very unusual situation because typically for issues of development or policy, countries in the Gulf would look towards the West. They have a lot of history with the UK and of course with the US as well. What we've seen for the past year, and I don't mean to insult our friends and neighbors in the UK or the US, but those countries have not really handled this in a very capable manner. And China, on the other hand, where it started around this time last year as being perceived as kind of the victim that was the recipient of a lot of aid from the region, really got a handle on it quite quickly. We could debate the means. It was quite draconian, and the people in Wuhan, I'm sure, were not very happy with the way it turned out. But in terms of issues of governance, countries here in the Gulf would look at how China's handled this, and they find it really quite appealing. And that's not just an issue of pandemic. This also extends into other issues as well. We tend to think of Western democracies as having a lot of the answers for development and policy issues. What we see in the Gulf is these are not democracies by any stretch. When they look at China, they see a country that has really handled a lot of developmental questions in a way that's very attractive. If you can go from one of the poorest countries in the world in 1978 to the second biggest economy, you can do this without any kind of political reform, but massive economic growth. That's tremendously attractive to a lot of authoritarian countries around the Middle East. So when you look at how China's kind of solved some of these development issues and how they've handled this pandemic, I think you'll see that China's presence in the Gulf is actually quite deep and broad. So I'll stop here. I think I've already hit 3 minutes, but look forward to questions and to the insights from my fellow panelists.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for this very insightful initial remarks. And I'm definitely sure that a lot of questions will come on this. Professor Twigg, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for the opportunity to share the screen with such a distinguished group of panelists. So I'll focus specifically on vaccine diplomacy, looking at Russia, which is my area of expertise. And in the global vaccine race, Russia was very clearly the first out of the gate in some ways. Russia's Sputnik V vaccine, V is for victory, was the first COVID vaccine in the world to be approved by a national government back in August of 2020. And Russia was aggressively marketing Sputnik V well before any of the Western vaccines had cleared regulatory approval. Sputnik V is now registered in 56 countries around the world. As of today, Vietnam has been added to the list, and it's hard to keep up because that number is going up pretty much every day. So many countries now have deals to receive Sputnik V doses straight from Russia. Even more are set to receive Sputnik V doses that are manufactured somewhere else, like India, or they're set to receive the formula and the technology so that they can make Sputnik V themselves. So what are Russia's goals here? I think there are 3 vaccine diplomacy goals at work in Russia. First is that Sputnik V is a symbol of Russia's return to great power status. It's about pride. It's about respect. It's about national stature. Being the first in the world to blaze the trail for the way out of this once-in-a-century global pandemic puts Russia back on the map as a scientific and technological power. Russia's trying to change the narrative here. Russia is no longer some drunken backwater that relies exclusively on the sale of oil and natural gas and minerals and other things that you can dig out of the ground. And they portray Sputnik V this way quite deliberately. When the vaccine was first approved, when Sputnik V was first approved, it had a website. And a prominent feature on that website was a button that you could push as the website loaded. There was a built-in delay, and as you push this button, it told you to turn your audio all the way up, and the sound that you heard over the audio was the beep, beep, beep that you heard broadcast from space back in 1957 when the Soviet Sputnik satellite was the first man-made object to be sent into space. So that was a hallmark moment for Soviet superiority in the space race. And it's not an accident that they're evoking that memory now with the very name Sputnik for their vaccine. A second goal clearly that Russia wants to achieve here is the exercise of soft power. Poor and middle income countries, including in the Middle East, are desperate for access to vaccines. And Russia realizes that there's potential diplomatic benefit from appearing as a savior during this unprecedented global crisis. And in particular, Russia is taking great pains to contrast its own generosity against the relative selfishness, at least up until recently, of the United States, the UK, other European countries that gobbled up all of the first available doses of Pfizer, Moderna, the other Western vaccines through these pre-purchase agreements. The rich countries pre-purchased enough vaccine early on to cover their own populations several times over, leaving the rest of the world with nothing. And Russia is very anxious to highlight these inequities in its own role in solving those inequities. Then third and lastly, Russia sees Sputnik V as a business opportunity. COVID vaccines are a multi-billion-dollar business, and Russia obviously wants to maximize market share. They're offering Sputnik V at about $20 for a full course of 2 doses. That's quite a bit cheaper than Pfizer or Moderna. There's also a longer term set of interests here. Russia traditionally has not been much of a player on global pharmaceutical markets, and they'd like this vaccine to be a wedge to get other countries to consider buying other drugs and pharma products from them as well. So in closing, there are several important caveats here when thinking about how likely it is that Russia is achieving these goals or will be able to achieve these goals. And for now, I'll mention just one, and that's that the way Russia proceeded with Sputnik V didn't exactly inspire confidence at first. Both international consumers and really domestic consumers, the Russian population inside Russia, have lingering doubts about Sputnik V because it was approved before it had even begun large-scale clinical trials. So they put the cart way before the horse. And there's a perception then, a correct perception, that development of this vaccine was rushed, that Sputnik V skipped the line, so to speak. It didn't go through full scientific and regulatory vetting because of top-down political pressure to be first, to be the first in the world. And there was a fear that this may have impacted the vaccine's safety or its quality. So Putin made a huge gamble when he launched this thing before it was proven. Now, since then, the vaccine's safety and efficacy have been confirmed. Results have been published in The Lancet, an international peer-reviewed journal. So it's a gamble that's paid off, but the risk was tremendous, including for potential partners in the Middle East, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on. So I'll stop right there. Thanks again for the opportunity to contribute some introductory thoughts.
Thanks so much, Dr. Twigg. That was also incredibly interesting, and of course, there's a lot to be said about Russian diplomacy in the Middle East, and we will have the time to do that. I'll leave the floor to Professor Zoubir. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you to the Institute of Peace and Diplomacy for the kind invitation. I don't have a title of vaccine diplomacy simply because I would like to submit to you, for those who have done any research on China's health assistance, health aid to the developing world. And that was born basically a couple of years or so after the foundation of the People's Republic of China. That's, it goes way back in the 1950s. And if you have looked at China's role in Africa, it is tremendous. It's tremendous. I tell you a personal experience. I was a child. I'm originally from Algeria. The first foreign doctors, the first medical team that was based in an overseas country was Algeria. It was in 1964. And up to today, there are these rotating medical teams, and there are I forgot how many hundreds of thousands of Algerians who were delivered, babies delivered by Chinese doctors, and you have also the traditional Chinese medicine and so on, like acupuncture and everything. So that's to clarify that China's health diplomacy, if you want to put it directly, it's health diplomacy, but it has served, of course, the PRC in using it as soft power, I would say successfully, because as someone who travels to Africa, I've seen the number of hospitals that have been set up there, including, dealing with those diseases, infectious diseases and so on. And you all remember also during the Ebola, the Chinese were already present in the field of helping. But this is all underpinned by a philosophical conception in Chinese soft power or health diplomacy, which, by the way, has been now connected to the Belt and Road Initiative. This is why I say it's not new. And you look at the Belt and Road now has a parallel element, which is the Health Silk Road, whereby China said that they would build hospitals along the road, treating the sick, training people, and so on and so forth. So the underpinning, the philosophical underpinning, is this notion of South-South cooperation, of developing. and this notion that some scholars called moral realism, in the sense that, you know, you do it for the common good. That is, it's a common good, including the vaccines. These were common good. You know, there was that pledge from the Chinese that as soon as there would be, you know, they discover vaccines, they would try to give it or sell it at a low price to the developing countries. And you know that the three pharmaceutical companies, you know, Sinovac and Sinopharm and the other one whose name escapes me now, you know, they have started, and now there are many Middle Eastern countries that are going to manufacture those vaccines. So that is basically, you know, the way that China is advancing. It's, if you want to call it soft power, give it another name, but the reality on the ground, and that's why I insist on this notion that it is not new. Now that it has another dimension, you know, to reach some other objectives, it's something else. But the collaboration in the health sector that is so deficient in so many Middle East and North African countries. So it was no surprise when the Chinese suffered, you know, the virus in the beginning. You had all the Middle East, the MENA countries contribute, you know, something to China. And as soon as it happened in the MENA itself, I was in Doha at that time. I was doing my fellowship, and I saw, you know, what the Qatar Airways, which was one of the only airlines, you know, delivering the medicines and so on. And it was not just to Qatar, but also to the rest of the region. And there was this, you know, they had those online discussions with the doctors, exchanges, and so on. So there was this. I believe if you look at even at the narratives coming from the Middle Eastern governments, they have adopted the very same language that the Chinese would use, you know, this notion of common destiny, you know, the shared common destiny, and so on, this new narrative that the Chinese have come up with. And what was fascinating, I did a whole study on China's health diplomacy under the pandemic. And what was amazing is this, that China did not give only to to its partners. In the beginning, I thought maybe, okay, the aid would go to countries that are favorable to China or have been friends with China for a while. It was not the case. And you could see the cooperation with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, with Israel, with Turkey, you know, name it. And they managed somehow there was a little glitch with the Turks regarding Armenia, because there were some packages which had the name, you know, in Armenian and so on, and it was resolved rather quickly. But what I'm saying is that this diplomacy, this health diplomacy, has been around for a long time, and I believe that it will continue. And it has resulted in not just a positive image on the part of the governments, and Jonathan has explained, you know, how they looked at the governance or how they managed to control, you know, to contain the virus and so on, but also at the popular level. In other words, if you look at the recent opinion polls in the region, most of them are rather positive, and they are negative towards the Western powers, which, by the way, today we talk about vaccine nationalism and so on. And by the way, I mean, I live in France, and they haven't been able to deliver to everybody yet, but let alone to give to the developing world. So it's happening. There are donations of this vaccine. Egypt is receiving a lot, some of which was coming through the UAE, but now it's donated directly. Algeria has gotten it. Morocco has also gotten it and is going to manufacture it to distribute it elsewhere. I think overall they have done quite well. And I think that the populations in the MENA are not going to question whether it's Chinese or Russian or what have you. It's a necessity, and they know that they're getting, and there are some advantages. At least, Judy talked about Sputnik, even the conservation and so on, when you think about the logistics and the cost and so on, it is quite appealing to developing countries. I don't want to, I'll be more than happy to answer some other issues during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zoubir. I will now leave the floor to Dr. Whiteside for our final introductory remark. So, Dr. Whiteside, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me go to COVID more broadly and talk about that, and then we can move on to the discussion. I think we need to be aware that COVID is affecting all our lives in ways that we had no idea it would. It is, without doubt, the biggest health crisis of my life. And I was, as Judy mentioned, came into health and health work via HIV and AIDS. Just so you're all aware, we're talking about 125 million people infected at the moment, and that number continues to rise. Most people don't get seriously ill, and the risks are age and underlying health conditions, but COVID has stopped the world, and it's changed how we live, it's changed how we work, and it may even change our values, and that's a very important point to discuss with regard to diplomacy. So in terms of where it is, the numbers, the OECD is the hardest hit. The USA has over 30 million infections. Countries with over 10 million infections are Brazil and India. And then in Europe, you have Russia, the UK, France, all over 4 million. Italy, Spain, Turkey, Germany, Colombia, Argentina, Mexico, and Poland, 2 and 4 million. And so it goes. The rest of the region has fewer than 500,000. And the question which we would ask ourselves is, could numbers rise? And the answer is, in the absence of interventions, yes. Now, let me just say, for anyone who wants to go into this in more detail and look at individual countries, a really helpful website is the Johns Hopkins coronavirus website, and you can actually fiddle with the numbers there and look at what's going on in your area. So vaccines, why vaccines? Well, the answer is that non-medical interventions, or as we call them, NMIs, are very limited. Masks, physical distancing, and I prefer physical to social distancing, hand washing, and that's really about it. So we really do, and everything that we do other than those are actually subsets of that. So a lockdown is an enforced physical and social distancing. The idea of herd immunity, well, it's been argued, but who knows? So we really do need a vaccine. And this is going to be the way we get out of this. It's going to be the way that we achieve the maximum return. I think it's probably worth noting that the question of who gets the vaccine is quite an important one to have discussed. It needs to be discussed at a national level. If you want to achieve the maximum in saving lives or prolonging lives, then you want to give it to the most vulnerable people, who are the older people. If you want to do the maximum for the economy, then you want to give it to a different group of people. And that's a conversation which each country needs to have. So what vaccines do we have? We've got 3 from the West, Pfizer and BioNTech, which is the first to come out. It's quite difficult to store and administer. Oxford University and AstraZeneca, and if we want to have a conversation about global health diplomacy, oh my word, there's the place to be, with a fight going on between Britain and the European Union at the moment. It's so complicated. I was on a radio program this morning and they said to me, can you explain it? And I had to say, no, I can't. You haven't got long enough. We don't have long enough today, but my word, there's an example for vaccine diplomacy going into the future. And then of course we got the Russian Sputnik, which, as Judy said, is $20. And then we've got the 3 from China. Now, the problem with the Chinese vaccines is we don't know much about them. And I think you probably do if you read Chinese, but if you don't know much about them. And so that leads to a Western view, and it is, let me stress this, it is a Western view that if we don't know much about them, then they're probably not that good. And that's why we need to be, and that I think that's a really important point to be aware of. So we need to make vaccines accessible. COVAX is the international project which is to unite the world and ensure that people will have access to vaccines. I'm not certain where the Chinese vaccines fit into COVAX. I just don't know this. Again, it's a lack of information which I have. The reality of where we are with vaccines is that, with the exception of the Israel, which is close over 100%, the UK, the USA, and countries like the United Arab Emirates, Chile, and the Qatar and Bahrain, the world is doing really horrendously. I'm sure my colleague from France could make comments on how appallingly badly they're rolling out their vaccine initiative there. Here we're well over half the adult population, and it's going forward very, very quickly. So what about ways forward? I'm going to say there are two possibilities. One is, in the best world, everyone who needs protection gets it, and that we can talk about who are the people who need it. It may not be healthy 25-year-olds like some of the people on this panel, Eunice, for example, but people like me, yes, definitely. I'm afraid, and I've had my first dose. The second, and so the best situation is everyone gets the protection, and you need pandemics brought under control will need boosters. In the worst situation, we have variants which are more infectious and more deadly, and we need adjusted annual vaccines, or perhaps even more frequently. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whiteside, for this. And again, there's a lot to be discussed. So I would say we'll start back to Dr. Fulton, asking him a couple of questions, and then I will go following the same path we followed with the initial remarks, and see if we can expand a little bit all this very interesting thing I've heard, and I think our audience is pretty happy with what has been said and quite thought-provoked. So Dr. Fulton, I'll start with you. So my first question is basically, you kind of mentioned this, but I want to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit on how the COVID-19 pandemic had an impact on public opinion, especially in the Gulf towards China. And if so, how Beijing vaccine diplomacy, which has been in full display in the Persian Gulf, has served China interest in the region, how has impacted again on the public opinion in the Persian Gulf?
Well, it's tough to measure public opinion because that just simply doesn't exist in most of this region. You can find things like the Arab Barometer that looks at some countries in the Middle East, but in the Gulf, you're not going to find very much reliable data. What you can see is that, so I live in the UAE, where they're using, different Emirates are using different vaccines. In Abu Dhabi, they use the Sinopharm, and they did the trial here. They're doing a lot of cooperation with China on Sinopharm. And you see leaders and civil servants and everybody's had access to it. They very publicly use it. It's quite interesting because just on a popular level, we've all grown up with, I shouldn't say we all, I mean, Eunice and you, Jacopo, grew up in a world where China was seen as a powerful country. I was born in '75, so when I was growing up, China was still kind of seen as the place where they made cheap junk that nobody wanted. But my students don't see China this way. And still, it was seen as kind of the second rank of electronics or consumer goods or whatever. Now they're like, hey, Sinopharm. China's seen as a positive, provider of public goods. Whereas before it was always kind of seen as a free rider in the Gulf, just kind of piggybacking on the American security guarantee to just kind of build economic relations. And that's just not the case anymore. It's gone from being seen as a follower to more of an active participant. China's been trying to change this narrative with the Belt and Road Initiative since 2013 that it is a contributor to global public goods. And I think a lot of folks in the West will roll their eyes, but here in the region, they don't see it this way. They see China as playing a more positive role. So I think in terms of how people see it, On this side of the Gulf, it's quite positive. On the other side of the Gulf in Iran, that's a different matter, because there they have a much more vibrant press, I think. And you could see, especially during early days of the pandemic, when Iran was brutally hit, people were incredibly critical. And there got to a point where I believe a spokesperson for the Ministry of Health, I think, had made public comments about how he didn't believe the Chinese numbers on COVID. And, that very day, somebody pulled him in front of the camera and said, take that back, whereas here in the UAE, they were, I believe, the first place to publicly release the trial data on the trial 3 of the Sinopharm. So it has changed public perception. It's changed elite perceptions. China's gone from being seen as kind of, a country that you can do business with, but not really rely on for much else. And I think that perception has changed tremendously here in the Gulf. And I'd say throughout the rest of the region, this Abraham Accord, there's a lot of coordination between China and the UAE and Israel. And I know that's seen as a diplomatic coup for the US, but this is something where China's actually made pretty substantial gains as well. Just before I came on, a lot of people were contacting me on Twitter. The Chinese foreign minister is here in the Gulf for a very big visit, 6 countries in the Middle East over the next week or so. And he's in Saudi today advocating for a Chinese-led mediation between Israel and Palestine. I don't believe anybody in Israel or Palestine wants a Chinese answer to this question, but it's just a change of perception where people are seeing China as an important actor, I think. So, it definitely has changed in how people see it here.
Thank you so much. The second question I want to ask you, Jonathan, is something that I will basically ask everyone else in the next couple of minutes, is about the sort of great power competition that is apparently going on in the Middle East, or will go on. We will see developing in the next few years. So my question is, do you think that broadly the COVID-19 crisis and the subsequent vaccine diplomacy will somehow give an advantage to China in this supposed great power competition in the Middle East and specifically in the Gulf, or vice versa, we will see somehow, a negative impact on the Chinese momentum in the region?
Okay, this is an interesting one for me, because it's kind of hard to balance this question. You either sound like a panda hugger or a panda slugger, and I don't think I'm either. I'm a political scientist, so I try to keep, a pretty neutral look. But from what I can see, this whole idea of great power competition is really something people in DC talk about a lot. It's not something people in the Gulf talk about a lot. And it's certainly not something, it's not the way China looks at the region. Now, I don't mean this in like China's, pure as the driven snow. China has interests and they pursue it in a certain way. But China, if you look at the way they've approached the Middle East, and this could take like an entire hour for me to go through, but I'll try to do it quickly. If you look at things like the Belt and Road White Paper or the China Arab Policy Paper, they've gone out of their way to develop a presence in the Middle East that actually complements America's leadership. They don't see themselves as competing with America or challenging it. They don't want to have a militarized presence. They want an economic driven presence. They're here to make money, basically, for good or for bad. If you look at the countries, except Iran, that China does the most business with, that China is the closest to, they're all US allies or partners. And that's by design. China is trying to develop a presence here that promotes the status quo, because the Belt and Road needs stability. So you'd see that countries like Iran or Qatar, until recently, that were kind of outside the status quo, weren't getting a lot of Chinese projects or contracts or investment, whereas a country like the UAE or Saudi or Egypt were getting boatloads of Chinese money and contracts. So I kind of reject the premise of the question. I don't think they see it in terms of great power competition. I think they see it in terms of opportunity, and certainly COVID has provided a lot of opportunities for them. But one of the things that we'll see is that I think China is going to work very, very hard to try to develop a more positive relationship with the US, just because they're not ready to challenge the US in any of this stuff. They don't have power projection in the Gulf or in the Middle East, and I don't think they have aspirations for it. Their core interests are domestic. Their core concerns are domestic pressures, economic pressures, governance issues. And I don't think they see themselves in a position to challenge the US in anything really at this point.
Great, that was super interesting. Thank you so much, Jonathan. I will move directly to Dr. Twigg and to the Russian side of the equation, if we want to call it like that. So you talked beautifully and very, in a very interesting way about these 3 goals if we can call it like that, of Russia vaccine diplomacy in the Middle East. So my question is, as a consequence of Russia vaccine diplomacy in the Middle East, we will see a renewed Russian momentum in the region, or, yeah, what's your forecast?
So I think as we look at American policy in the Middle East, we've got the Biden team that is, very much still putting together its Middle East policy right now, trying to recalibrate relations, move away from President Trump's one-sided alliance with Saudi Arabia. Russia is taking advantage of this moment, this transition period, trying to make it clear that its impact on the Middle East can be a match for the United States. Russia's trying to position itself as a moderator, as an influencer, not just as a provider of arms, but also as a provider of vaccines. If we remember early in the pandemic, a year ago, Russia's relationships in the Middle East had taken a negative turn. Russia and the Gulf states and OPEC couldn't agree on production quotas, and that led to a pretty sudden drop in oil prices. That was a low point. I think Sputnik V has given Russia a new opportunity in the region. The vaccine has been approved, the Russian vaccine has been approved by more than a dozen Middle Eastern and North African countries. Some are aggressively using it. It's in clinical trials in UAE. Preparations are underway for transfer of technology to establish production of Sputnik V in Turkey and Egypt. There are talks about conducting clinical trials in Saudi Arabia. Tens of thousands of doses have been sent to the Palestinian Authority. So Russia is pretty clearly trying to engineer a reputational shift here. After having intervened militarily in the region, the donation of vaccines gives Russia a chance to present itself as more of a humanitarian actor. One more thing I'll note here is that we're starting to see examples of vaccines used in the region as diplomatic currency. So last month, Israel made a deal brokered by Russia to pay for a shipment of Sputnik V vaccines to Syria in exchange for the safe return from Syria of an Israeli woman who had been detained after illegally crossing the border. So I won't be surprised to see more of this kind of transactional arrangement.
Right, that's very interesting indeed. And so, yeah, and you mentioned at least at the beginning of your answer, the United States. So the feeling is, at least from my known privileged perspective, if you want to call it like that, also someone who read the news about the Middle East currently and every day, basically, that, Russia and China have been much more proactive in this vaccine diplomacy than the United States. So is this true? And, why has this happened, basically?
So early on, we saw the Trump administration in the United States very explicitly pursuing an America First approach. There was no attempt to hide it. They boasted about an America First approach. And that was an approach, as I said earlier, that involved massive pre-purchase agreements of enough vaccine doses to vaccinate the American population many times over. That was an attempt to diversify the portfolio, to make sure we had plenty of whatever vaccine would end up panning out from a scientific and regulatory perspective. Politically, that may have been a smart move within the United States, but of course that leaves, as has been the case with HIV/AIDS, with H1N1, that leaves the rest of the world sitting on the sidelines for months or even years. The Biden administration has definitely tried to turn that situation on its head, both in terms more broadly of American participation in global health institutions. We said no to the withdrawal from WHO. We immediately joined COVAX, the global facility to ensure, or to try to ensure, vaccine access that Alan mentioned a few moments ago. And now we see the United States agreeing that it will send some of its excess doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has not been approved yet here in the United States, sending those to Mexico and Canada, and I suspect to other places as time goes on. So we clearly see a shift now in American policy the more we get into the Biden administration. So I think the key question goes back to some comments that have been made throughout this panel, and that's that when push comes to shove, will people in poor and middle income countries really pay that much attention to where their vaccine has come from. And as the rich world kind of catches up, and especially the United States, and once Western Europe sorts out the mess that it's in right now, as Western Europe catches up in this vaccine diplomacy game, as the narrative shifts more from one of vaccine nationalism to one of vaccine generosity and diplomacy, and we hope equity as time goes on, will we look back and say that China and Russia have kind of had their moment right now, and maybe that moment passes as we move forward, and COVAX and bilateral deals involving Western countries that perhaps come on more favorable terms, better price points, better assistance with vaccine distribution, going the last mile to actually get vaccines into people's arms. Do those arrangements end up sticking in people's memories in the longer term?
Thank you so much. Okay, so let's shift back, let's say, to China somehow with Dr. Zoubir. So, Zoubir, I would say China has used this COVID-19 pandemic to relaunch the Elf Silk Road, which is not new, as far as I know, has been launched years ago as part of the Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, whatever you will call it. And my question is, do you think and do you see that the region, so the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa, and also Africa, if you want to comment on that, has been receptive to this project, to this Elf Silk Road project, or especially once the pandemic has gone, hopefully soon, the interest of the region towards China will go back to this economic rationale that has so far dominated this encounter?
I don't have a crystal ball. I don't anticipate what will be, but I can tell you from what I see today and how it will unfold. I focus more on the North Africa region all the way down to Africa itself. I try to convey the point that the health diplomacy is not new. That's one. It's not going to go. It is part of this rationale or philosophical underpinning of the diplomacy. It's a big dimension. The perception of China is no longer. I remember when no one wanted to wear a shirt made in China. In Algeria, for instance, they said it's made in Taiwan. I mean, they didn't know the difference between the two, but they would say that it's Taiwan. Today, there's a different thing. They see the big projects, highways, buildings, housing, and so on. And in my research on China in North Africa, you will see that some of the imports from China are not the cheap products. They consist of machinery and industrial goods, and now you see the cars and what have you. And so there is a change of perspective. So I believe that the economic relations will increase. They will continue, especially when after the COVID, I follow the debates on who is going to recover first, who is going to have a higher growth, and so on and so forth. But I think it will continue. The health diplomacy will still be there. I think the Chinese would still be pushing for this ambitious Belt and Road. And as I said, the Health Silk Road it's not just the Health Silk Road, the digital Silk Road, the maritime, they're all going together. And I think they're there to stay. And the perception has changed. And I can jump on the next question that you had regarding this great power. In the region, they understand it. And I'll tell you one thing, the more you push in that, culturally speaking, in that region, that somehow the Chinese are bad, the Chinese are this, it does not work. The governments will play, they are trying to balance out each side. Diversification is helping them, finding new big players who can, contribute to their development it's a great thing. So they're not, I remember at the end of the Trump administration pushing them, you're with us or against us, sort of the George W. Bush, mentality. That does not work. They're going to use what they believe is in their own interest. What I find sad, from my perspective, and maybe Judy, because she follows Russia at the same time, is that I hope that the Biden administration, by responding positively, at least in terms of promise to give those $2 billion to the World Health Organization, so is real. It's not part of this rivalry, but instead, to work for the common good. And I'm not being some sort of idealistic, freak, but it's reality, because for those of you who are familiar with health diplomacy and so on, there was great cooperation between the United States and China in Africa, for instance, and that worked, and it worked even during the Ebola. So I believe that it should not be like, aha, since the Chinese are doing this, I'm going to do that, to compete with them. Rather, how do we handle, and I join Alan on this one, why, we should not leave behind the ones who don't have. So there should be, instead, yes, there might be rivalry in the security sector or in some areas. That's normal among states, but there are areas which necessitate the cooperation of the great powers, to help the developing countries. If not, we're back to that. We are still in it, this widening gap between the poor. And what is the point if we're all safe in the West, in the North, we're safe, we are vaccinated, the rest of the world is not vaccinated, does not have access to medical care, doesn't have access to the vaccine. So if the Chinese are contributing, if the Russians are really contributing to vaccination on a wider scale, why not? So and I join Jonathan fully when he says, I mean, it's all in all my research and what I've been doing. I don't see the Chinese being interested in supplanting the United States or someone else in the region. They don't give a hoots. The Chinese are there to do business. They want business. They want to work on projects. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, they pack and leave. But they are there to build. Yes, they have some geopolitical interest. They have interest in getting closer to Europe, in some places, to build ports and so on, which is part of the maritime Silk Road. But I don't think they're out there to want the United States to leave. On the contrary, the United States, for instance, in the Gulf, it serves the interests of China, their presence. They guarantee the security. Please stay. We're not interested in getting into this fight between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and in the region where I focus on, or the Western Sahara conflict, or what have you. If they can stay away from those troubles, they would. So, but I don't think, there is some areas where competition or sort of rivalry is positive. If you're showing me that you are providing serious development aid, serious industrialization, that's fine. That's good for everybody. I remember interviewing one of our ambassadors in Africa, and I asked him, what do you think? And this was in 2000. It was under the Obama administration, and he told me. He said, look, I won't name the country to keep his anonymity, but he told me, he said, it's great that China is here because they're building the infrastructure, and this infrastructure is good for our business people. So I think it could be this kind of collaboration instead of rivalry is helpful to the rest of the continent or the rest of the developing world.
Thank you so much, Dr. Zoubir, especially for answering my second question before I asked it to you, which was perfect for our timing, which is running a little bit out. So, Dr. Whiteside, I hope you forgive me if I ask you only one of the questions, of the two questions I prepared for you before the panel, but I see there are a couple of questions coming from the audience, so I would have some time at the end to answer them, at least trying to. So what I'm going to ask you is, one of the trends we have seen right now with this COVID diplomacy and all this COVID crisis in the region, and by referring to the Middle East especially, is that countries in the region are relying on great powers, if you want to call it like them, to develop and supply of vaccine, and so basically for their health in this time of crisis. And perhaps the only exception is Iran, which is trying to develop its own vaccine. So my question is, do you think this will have some sort of impact on these countries, these regional countries, medical systems, health systems, and medical research? What we will see coming out from this crisis and this over-reliance maybe on great powers for the health?
Well, I think we need to recognize that although science has become simpler in some ways, it still requires a great deal of investment. So we've got centers of excellence. And I think of the area around Cambridge in the United Kingdom or in parts of the United States. And I do think that you will tend to see the best developments coming from those centers of excellence, whether they're in the West or in China or in Russia. So I don't believe that most countries would be able to start and develop things from scratch. There's a constraint of science, there's a constraint of laboratories, there's a constraint of a history of doing biomedical research. So I don't think it would be good use of resources to start trying to set up something completely new to look into this, but you can partner, and that's, I think, what we'll see more and more of.
Thank you so much, Dr. Whiteside. I think now I'll try, we have a couple of minutes. I will try to ask some of the questions that came from the audience, which are actually very interesting and complex. And I think what we can do is I'll ask the question, and whoever of you feel that you can give an answer can, jump in and try to answer. So the first question is, I cut shortly, but it's a very interesting one. Do you see that vaccine diplomacy in the Middle East is more a political concept or a medical concept? If you can somehow, get what Aref Bijan means by that, which I think is very interesting.
That's a very interesting question. And one of the reasons why it's so interesting is because I think there are questions about where diseases will come from. And we did see the rise of MERS, which was the Middle East respiratory system in the Middle East. So I think the answer will be, if you talk to the medical people, it will be medical diplomacy, monitoring and looking at what's going on. However, I don't know how much will come from the Middle East, because it's not where most zoonotic transference of diseases will happen. That will be in highly dense populated places or subtropical places.
Sure.
Can I take
yes,
follow up, since you said political, or is it health or political? I think it has been politicized. It has been put in this sort of rivalry, which I'm condemning, because from the very beginning, if you compare the MENA region with Europe or the United States, in the MENA, there was a very positive reaction to it. In the West, it was mask diplomacy. Most of the articles were, aha, you see what the Chinese are doing. And again, I am not a Chinese lover or basher. I try to be objective, but I think it's been politicized, and that wasn't healthy. And the problem too is that the Chinese also made some mistakes. Some diplomats, bragging about the success and so on. But I think they learned the lesson. They come down on that argument. But I see that today we are pushing for further politicization. The fact that if you follow what's going on in Europe, Merkel had said that she was welcoming Sputnik V, and all of a sudden now the Europeans are mostly negative. It's negative. I think that one needs to separate what is something for humanity and what is interest. core interest. The fact that if the Russian vaccine is good and it's proven to be 92%, effective, let it come to the people. Here they told us they started going with the AstraZeneca vaccine. Then they suspended it. Now they may start it again. And then the US now is saying, wait a second, AstraZeneca, maybe the data was not all that correct. They used, why not? It's scientific, it's medical. If not, you're encouraging those who say, oh, I am not going to get vaccinated. And here we have a big percentage, especially now after the suspension, although it has resumed, but the suspension has caused people to question whether it was necessary to vaccinate or not. And I think this politicization of something that is so important to humanity, to human beings, to all of us as a community, I think is wrong. I honestly believe it's wrong.
Okay, thank you so much. Another quick question, which I'm basically gathering from what the one people in the audience asked, and then we have basically run out of time, and I see Jonathan probably has to go. But is basically what I'm trying to ask you is, do you think COVAX program is successful and will be successful in giving and spreading vaccines, especially in those countries that have the more difficulties to get access to vaccine, or there should be something else that great powers, especially the leading global powers, can do to on that realm?
I'll just briefly answer that. As recently as a couple of months ago, I think we all thought COVAX was on life support. It looked like it might never have gotten off the ground. It's remarkable, the acceleration of COVAX, with the commitments from the Biden administration and others very recently. And I'll just note that earlier this week, Russia indicated that it had applied to have Sputnik V included in the COVAX portfolio of vaccines. I think that's a vote of Russian confidence in where COVAX is going to sit in terms of provision of vaccines to the world.
Thank you so much. Anyone else? Of you? Okay, so I think, unfortunately, sorry, right, okay, I'm messing up. Sorry, I think we are done for today, unfortunately, because the discussion was fantastic and it's been great having you all here. Obviously, this is a panel that could have gone for 2 hours, 3 hours, one day, and probably we would have exhausted all the discussion about vaccine diplomacy in the Middle East. But I would say thank you so much for our panelists for coming today. And thank you so much for the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for organizing this panel. And hopefully we'll have more time to discuss about vaccine diplomacy in the coming future, which hopefully without a pandemic. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.